Good evening, and welcome to the Marion Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske, and I am one of the Ath Fellows this year. Racial identity is a complicated and dynamic subject, but for much of American history, the official view on race has been quite narrow. It wasn't until 2000, for example, that individuals had the option to identify as Hispanic or Latino on census forms, and even the most recent US government census expected Arab or Middle Eastern individuals to identify as white. Despite the Census Bureau's struggle to comprehend multiracial society, the United States has become increasingly diverse, both as a result of immigration and the blending of previously existing ethnic and cultural identities. Here tonight to discuss the historical and modern Blaxican or Black and Mexican experience in Los Angeles is Walter Luis Thompson Hernandez. Mr. Thompson Hernandez is a Los Angeles-based social documentary maker, multimedia journalist, and doctoral student at the University of California, Los Angeles. His stories and research have been featured by NPR, CNN, BBC, Fusion, Los Angeles Times, Remezcla, and Univision. His latest academic project will be featured in a forthcoming book titled Afro-Latinos in Movement, Critical Approaches to Blackness and Transnationalism in the Americas. His research and photographs have been featured in books, journal articles, and national and international media platforms. Mr. Thompson Hernandez is a graduate of the Latin American Studies Master's Program at Stanford University. Prior to completing his master's degree, he played Division I basketball at the University of Portland and played professionally for throughout Latin America for the Mexican national team. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Walter Luis Thompson Hernandez to the Athenaeum.
These glasses on. Thank you so much for that. It's super interesting because Luis is definitely my middle name, but nobody knew about that prior, and so you guys have definitely done your research, and that's incredible. That's really incredible. I want to start. Of course, I'm really honored to be here. Alejandra, thank you so much for helping make this happen. Priya, who I think is ill today, she has the flu, but she was also really, her help with this was extremely valuable. And of course, thank you to Brian as well for the AV help. I really appreciate that. Thanks, man. So this project is really, I think, an ode to Los Angeles, right, to LA, and really a way to try to understand Los Angeles through the lens of people who identify as Blaxicans, right? People who have one African American parent and one Mexican parent, and really trying to understand what this experience means today, kind of through this examination of Los Angeles' past, but also its potential future. And so this is a project that is inherently sort of multimodal, right? It fuses together traditional academic research methods, qualitative ethnography, with social media, right? And thinking about maybe the power of social media and the ways that stories get shared through social media and the ways that academic articles cannot, right? And thinking about how accessible social media is. I know my mom has Instagram, my aunts have Instagram, everyone has Instagram. And so, when I was thinking about the narratives and stories that were coming out of this project, I really thought about them, and I thought about, how do I best tell this story in a language that isn't esoteric, right? That isn't sort of jargony, but that is very real and emotive, right? So this project kind of speaks to all these different things. At the heart of this also is really a way to challenge how we think about race and identity, right? Thinking about how I think historically the term or word mixed or even biracial or multiracial for so many years kind of connotes this sort of black and white racial binary, right? And I know for people like myself who grew up in South LA, mixed to me meant black and white. So this really is a way to think about mixed and multiracial as also being black and brown as well, right? And not just black and brown, but also thinking about other sort of ethnicities as well. So that's kind of the heart of this project, and I want to make this as dynamic and as sort of open as possible. So if there's a question, speak up, interrupt. That's not a problem. But I want to start also with this slide and thinking about what this potentially means for this project, but also for Los Angeles. Is there any hip hop fans in here? Any rap hip hop fans? It's about like 10% of the room. Hip hop fans, 11%. Tupac. Does anybody know what song this is from? Take a wild guess. Absolutely. It's always hit or miss. It's always hit or miss, but that was good. So absolutely. So Black Love, Brown Pride are lyrics from a very sort of influential, a very powerful Tupac song that was recorded in, I think, 1994. The funny thing about this is that I took this photo not in Los Angeles, but in Oakland, right? And so, driving past this, I had to take a photo, I had to stop, and kind of had to think about the message, right? Black love, brown pride, kind of thinking about this message in this current sort of political and racial moment. And so these words and the sort of symbolism in this message is really, I think, also at the heart of this project, right? Thinking about ways to really challenge like white supremacy, thinking about structural racism in a way that aligns Black and brown people together, right? With that said, I also want to start not with a black screen, but with a video that I'll play here. I hope it works, Brian. So there's a rapper named MED. MED is originally from Oxnard, California, and he identifies as a black skin, and a lot of his music kind of touches on tones and themes that I'll be speaking about. So I'm gonna play this video. It's called Black Skin, Big Surprise, and I hope we can kind of, it kind of sets the tone for this talk.
Mystery is my story. Mystery is my story. Mystery is my story. But history, that's his story. But history, that's his story. But mystery, that's my story. But history, that's his goddamn story.
Yeah, to all my Negroes and Latinos. CA. What up, man? Just get real out here right now. So, rise up, fight for the right fight. Which is life. Check it. Yeah, black power and brown pride. How can you hold me when it pumps inside the pride? My ancestors plan my demise. Then slavery and even rape from my land. Time change, pain reverse. It hurts seeing the first black president. All in the search from burnt down churches. Mexicans birthing a revolution. Truth for one thing certain. The dreams off, but they plan a divorce with poverty, drugs, and gang news reporting. But won't show how they forced it on us. United, they gon' need reinforcement. Dated back to 1910. United from the liberty of sin. In Mexico City, blacks hid. Trying to escape tragedy. Gradually we did it. Now applaud to the most forgiven. Yeah. Look, overcame race hate, misplaced, separated fam from a stated landscape, advance in the slave trade, man-made horror, lynching, mothers raped, downsized borders, gave us rights like they did something for us. This when I write it like we're living the moment, even with the drama recorded in CA, brown and blacks war over corners, killed just to still pay rent to the owner, free but I feel that we get played over, no jobs for us, means of employment, deal for the dealers, and guess how it's flown in. Consulting to you, wake up. They slaving your brain in the school gangs feud with each other. Don't mean brag, mean the color of your skin when we came from the struggle. Saying.
Great. So what this video kind of highlights to me is the ways in which these very different worlds collide, right? Collide seamlessly, but there's often sometimes a not so seamless, fusion there, right? And so what that video also kind of represents is, the very sort of daily and constant negotiating of these different identities, right? Like thinking about like black and brownness, and how in so many ways like these sort of stories and these memories, right, have been conceptualized as these sort of mutually exclusive things, right? And identities. You have black people, you have brown people, but very rarely do we think about black and brown relations through the lens of black and brown in the same body, right? And so this is the Black Skins of LA project. And like I said, it's a project that kind of grows from this very real need to integrate, very important, right, and rigorous traditional academic methods with more accessible platforms like social media. And it's been interesting, right, because like on some hand, the popularity of that project kind of, it really aligns with the growing conversation about multiraciality in the US, right? According to the Pew Research Center, we know that the multiracial population is growing at 3 times the rate of the general population, right? In 1970, 1% of all babies born were multiracial. As of 2010, about 10% of all babies born are multiracial, right? So there is definitely, this fusion occurring. People are living together, working together, and sometimes loving together in sort of different capacities, right? But at the same time, I think what needs to be sort of spoken about is often the ways in which that the multiracial body gets, spoken about, written about in the context of popular media, right? There's often this very real practice of solely thinking about the multiracial experience through this lens of beauty, right? Of hair texture, of phenotype, of skin tone. Very rarely is there a focus on the sort of political and racial implications of multiracial identities, right? And it's also, kind of aligns with this growing sort of like post-racial, sort of very erroneous post-racial ideology, right? About how in some ways people think about multiracial and interracial relationships as being a racial panacea and really the answer for all problems related to race, right? But we know that that's completely erroneous. So I say that, and I'm critical of the ways in which we think and create stories. But when Nicki Minaj, right, shares about your project and really contradicts everything that you say, that I say, about how problematic it is, right? I think you kind of have to like, okay, take a step back and kind of, think about like why Nicki Minaj is talking about your project in this way. She thinks it's gorgeous. Maybe I can think it's gorgeous too, right? So it's interesting, right? How on some level we have to be critical, but we can also like support and really acknowledge that there is a need for this project and its sort of popularity, right? But again, this story is far from novel. Los Angeles in 1781 was founded by a group of 44 settlers, over half of whom were Afro-Mexican, right? These were settlers who hailed from Mexican states like Sonora, Sinaloa, who were extremely formative in constructing Los Angeles' infrastructure. And so, but prior to that, the Spanish colony in Mexico created a system of interracial mixture, of multiracial identity called Las Castas. And so Las Castas were essentially a racial taxonomy, created by the Spanish crown, where they sort of hired Spanish artists to document racial mixture in the colonies throughout Mexico, right? There were names like mestiza and mestizo, which meant that a Spanish colonizer, had relations with an indigenous woman. There were names like mulata mulato, which represented an African slave and someone of Spanish descent. There were so many different sort of variations, right? So this kind of helps us understand that, the sort of growing multiracial, we can say Black skin experience is far from novel. There is a very real sort of historical precedence, right? And at the same time, taking this back to Los Angeles, right? I keep on saying that Los Angeles' story, its own sort of genesis story, is inherently black and brown, right? This is a city that was founded by people like Manuel Gamero, Maria Tomasa Garcia, Antonio Mesa, Jose Cesario Moreno, Luis Manuel Quintero, right? People who identified as black, mulatto, mestiza, mestizo, Indian folks, right? What's interesting about this, though, and it kind of speaks to the very real differences between how race was constructed in Latin America and how race has been constructed in the US, is that, you know, at this point, this was still part of Mexico, right? So ideas about race sort of had this inherent sort of Latin American sensibility, right? So someone like Manuel Camero in 1781, who identified as mulatto and who was identified as mulatto, in 1791, Manuel Camero isn't identifying as mulatto anymore, right? He's identifying as mestizo, right? Luis Manuel Quintero, number 5 here, 10 years later, is not identifying as black, but he's identifying as mulatto. So there's this sort of aspirational sort of whiteness going on, right? Where because they became landowners and owned more cattle and had more capital throughout Los Angeles, they were able to identify as a wider sort of brand, right? So it's interesting how these ideas about race, even in this context, right? You know, there's a lot of sort of fluidity there and really kind of underlying the differences, right? The US, we know, the one drop rule, where if you have one drop of black blood, you're considered black, right? And existing in this almost intractable sort of position in society. But Latin America, for example, if you have one drop of white blood, you can essentially, you know, be born black, but die mulatto, mestizo, or white, essentially, right? And so now I kind of want to get into some of the narratives and stories and even photos that I've took over the past few years. And they kind of, again, you know, speak to these very real themes of existing in different worlds, in different bodies at the same time. Richard is a native of Los Angeles. He was born and raised in LA. His parents met in Arizona, on the border of Arizona, and migrated to LA in 1966. Richard shared with me, "I ethnically identify as Afro-Mexican. Racially, I embrace my blackness here in LA, and that is typically how I'm read and what my experience is. The identity of Afro-Mexican acknowledges my African roots as well as the land that we live on, because it belongs historically to indigenous Mexican peoples. My mom has always spoken about her family proudly in these terms. It's what I'd like to continue to promote." So what we see here, you know, even Richard's hat, right, this LA hat, kind of makes us think about this sort of like reclamation of land, of story, of memory, in spite of what has happened, this sort of very real historical erasure. You know, how in so many different ways, Los Angeles' Afro-Mexican story has been erased, right? And so what Richard is doing, what he's essentially speaking to, is a way to reclaim that story and to reclaim that land, essentially. And so like Richard, Amanda is also someone who is very sort of explicit, acknowledges, thinks about her identity in this very sort of political way. Took this photo in the summer of 2014 at the famous intersection of Cesar Chavez and Soto in East LA. And this is what Amanda shared with me. "When I was growing up, I encountered a lot of racism. It never ended. So growing up, I always felt like I was fighting for who I was. And I always felt like people were trying to put me down for who I was, even in my own family. I was raised by a single parent, and she was Mexican. So her family is Mexican, and were extremely racist towards me, and still are. But at this point, I have thicker skin, and I have a lot more pride in who I am, and it doesn't affect me anymore. So if you decide to call me a nigger or something, it doesn't faze me anymore. You're the one who was being hurt, so I was always fighting, and in the end, I won." So again, what this speaks to is you know, the very constant negotiation, right, of racial ideologies that both exist in Los Angeles, but also, you know, can be traced back to Mexico as well, right? You know, you have to question how and why and at what point did Amanda's relatives, her uncles, her aunts, her cousins, how did they construct these very these real sort of anti-black ideologies. You know, did they happen pre-migration or post-migration, right? Or both? And that's kind of a question that we have to think about. This is Justin in downtown LA. This is Teresa. Teresa's story is to me, I think, one of the most powerful stories that was shared with me. This is a photo that was taken in Folsom State Prison. She had very little contact with her father. Her parents met in South LA in the late 70s amid this like very real sort of gang warfare between black folks and brown folks. And what she shared with me kind of speaks to what it meant to grow up for her in South LA at this time. This picture was taken when I was 11 or 12 years old at Folsom State Prison. It was the ending of visiting session with my dad, and the only way to document the visitation was to pay $5 and take a picture inside the visiting room. There's a lot of emotions in this picture because I would go see him every 6 years. I was holding back tears in that picture because once it was taken and you realize that the next time you'll be able to give your father a kiss would be until the next visiting session. So Mari's story, pictured here, I think offers us another glimpse of the sort of complex and very layered nature of identity construction, right? It reminds me of this sort of intersection of ethnicity, of race, and of religion, right? Myri is someone who converted to Islam at the age of 19 when she was married in Compton, California. Her mother is Mexican and her father is African American. And so Myri's story, you know, it's not just about race or ethnicity, but there's also a sort of religious component here, right? And the ways in which, you know, our identities are already so layered, but you add religion and it sort of brings this entirely different context, right? I tell people that I'm an Afro-Latina because I am both and I feel strongly about that. I'm not just gonna say that I'm Puerto Rican or I'm black or I'm Mexican or whatever. No, I'm an Afro-Latina and you got to know that I am mixed with both. I'm not sure what it means to be an Afro-Latina in LA. That's a hard question. My mom and dad separated when I was 2, so I was basically raised by my Latino side. I would go visit my dad, but my first language was Spanish. I grew up in a house of Spanish speakers, food, and culture. Growing up, I was Catholic, and my grandma would take me to church to rezar and todo eso. But as I grew older, I chose my own path, and that's how I became Muslim. I converted. We share a lot of the same concepts, you know, Jesus, the Virgin Mary. I converted because of the Virgin Mary. I'm trying to follow in her footsteps and be a pure and modest woman and dedicate myself to God. Being Latina and Muslim is a struggle, though. It's a struggle because you're raised Catholic, and my Latino side would always ask me questions about it, but they're getting it now, slowly. I found my peace. I pray to one God, I respect everything, and it's part of my blood. So Mari's story also makes me think about this current sort of political and racial moment, right? In this Trump era, what it means to be both black, Latina, and Muslim, right? I think about, you know, political solidarities. I think about, you know, what it means to have almost each, and to be a woman, of course, right? But to really think about like how it must be to be in a body where each of your identities are sort of constantly under assault, right? And so I think about Myri through that lens, but I also think about her as existing in this sort of like larger picture, you know? Latino Muslims are the fastest growing sect within Islam in the US, right? There are approximately 200,000 Latino Muslims. And so this is sort of like a way to think about, you know, identity, not just through race and ethnicity, but also through religion as well. So I spoke about erasure earlier, and I kind of spoke about anti-black sentiments in Latino households and Mexican households. But this story of you know, Maggie's photo kind of speaks to all that, right? I think, visually we see, a younger, darker, young Maggie in this photo, and she may or may not, her phenotype may not reflect her relatives, right? Those are her sisters and her mother. So I think visually it's a very striking photo. It kind of elicits different questions, right? But there's an aspect, I think, here of survival in the context of the family that is revealed. What happens when someone like Maggie's mother, keeps the truth about her daughter's racial identity from fear of being scorned by her family and community. This is Maggie's story, right? She was born and raised in Long Beach, California, and grew up in a very sort of Mexican household, a very, culturally, ethnically Mexican home. Her father, Juan, and her mother raised her, right? And so Maggie always, grew up looking a little bit differently. She was a bit darker than her relatives, than her sisters, than her mother. Her hair was a little curlier. And so, Maggie would fight people because people would ask her if she was black, right? And so, and she would fight, and she would fight. And she would go home and ask her mother, am I black? Or why are people asking me this question? I know Juan's my father. He's Mexican. He's a mestizo. He's a brown man. Why do I look this way, right? And so what's interesting about this is that, I think twice a year, Maggie told me this black man named John would lived in their neighborhood and, grew very fond of Maggie, right? He would buy her, candies and ice creams and visit her about twice a year. And so, Maggie kind of questioned, like, who is John? Like, why is John so nice to me? And so years later, when Maggie was 18, her mother opens up to her, right? And she tells her that John was in fact her real father, And so this story about, about sort of these like very sort of tensions that exist between black and brown folks is a very real thing, right? Because it's not all about romance, it's not all about getting along, right? There are sometimes very real sort of anti-black sentiments in this moment where Maggie's mother thought that she would be scorned and ostracized and marginalized from her community should they find out that she had an affair with a black man. So today, Maggie is entirely close with her African-American relatives and her father, and it's a very sort of beautiful situation, but this is something that didn't occur about 10, 15 years ago, right? This is a picture of Maria, and Maria's holding the frame, and her parents met on the MTA bus. Her father was a bus driver who would see her mother get on the bus every single morning, and the way that they began to engage with one another, because Maria's mother didn't speak English, she was working in a factory in South LA, so her father, started to learn Spanish so he could speak to her mother, and eventually he asked enough friends, how to say, would you go out with me in Spanish, which took about 6 or 7 months. And fortunately, she had the same job, the same route, the universe came together, and they're still married to this day. The rest is history, right? But what this project also is about, it's not just about Mexican and African American people, right? I think the terms black and brown, are so vast and they're so infinite, right? It doesn't just mean African Americans, it doesn't just mean Mexicans, right? Blackness is vast and it's infinite, so it's brownness, right? And so what's interesting about this is that, while the title for this project is Blackskins, this is really thinking about what blackness looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like inside this Latino context, right? So what you have here, the woman on the left, her mother is from El Salvador, her father's African American. The gentleman on the right, his father is African American, his mother's Mexican. Their baby will have a very long explanation. When he gets older, he's gonna have to explain that to people. But like I said, it's not just about African Americans and Mexican. C's mother is African American, his father is from El Salvador as well. And really, you know, it's about really challenging this black and white racial binary, right? You know, allowing people who do not identify neatly within that binary to find ways to express themselves in a society that really wants to limit you to a box, right? To a very narrow, a very rigid sort of understanding of identity. And so Glaus and his sister here, for example, are Garifuna, right, from Honduras, and whose parents both immigrated to South Los Angeles in the early 1980s. The Garifunas, for those who don't know, are a black indigenous group from Honduras, from Guatemala, from Belize, from that region. And so these are folks who are identifying very strongly with these sort of like Latino, ethnic sort of norms, right? You know, music, food. But as you see here, phenotypically, they can be read as black, as African American, right? So there's this tension, right? You know, being racialized in South LA as an African American, but speaking in Spanish entirely at home, right? There's this sort of, there's something happening there, right? Where Glaus and his sister, you know, grow up ashamed to speak Spanish because they're growing up with teachers and a neighborhood that is telling them that they are black, and that because they are black, they cannot speak Spanish, right? So this kind of shows us, you know, like how sort of limiting these sort of identifiers are, right? This is David, who is Belizean, pictured in Venice Beach. This couple here is Afro-Puerto Rican. And so this idea of having a sort of triple consciousness, right? Blackness, Latino-ness, and sort of Americanness is something that Eva really spoke to me about. You know, her parents are Afro-Nicaraguan, and growing up in South Los Angeles, again, you know, being racialized as black, as African American, but really sort of identifying with her blackness and Latino-ness is something that she couldn't do so many times, right? She shared with me, there's no Nicaragua or Honduras parade out here. I would love to see some awareness that we're out here. I would love people to be conscious of that. When I always get some type of racism, it's always from Latinos. And the first thing I say is, what happened to mi gente? What happened to us feeling like a community and us being here as one? I wish that people would share their community with others and that we would be much more accepting. These are our parents. So the people who I've interviewed and have photographed over the past 3 years kind of all are between the ages of 21 to about 35, right? These are all people who at least one parent, you know, immigrated from Mexico or Central America and, you know, settled in and around South Los Angeles, right? If we know the history of South LA, the history of Los Angeles, we know that most of these people kind of grew up in the late 80s or early 90s. It was, some have called, a very sort of tumultuous time, you know, thinking about like Reaganomics, thinking about supply side, thinking about, you know, the epidemic of crack cocaine, gang violence in and around South LA in the late 80s and early 90s, is really a racial context that we have to take into consideration, right? What did it mean to grow up as both black and brown in a community that was almost always at odds with one another, right? You know, race riots were a very real part of the experience for so many people who I met with. And so, you know, of course, black and brown relations, you know, are often sort of conceptualized through like a very sort of like reductive and like very simple sort of lens, right? Either black and brown people are getting along or they're not, right? That's generally how the media kind of shapes these experiences. But we know that it's much more complex than that. This video that I'll show here kind of speaks to the political, economic, and racial context that a lot of the people who I've interviewed kind of faced growing up.
Tonight, the principal of the school told Fox News he was resigning and said that problems at Inglewood High go much deeper than today's riot. Christina Gonzalez has the story.
They can do what they want to do. We can't do. Just because it's a Mexican relation, they think they're going to f around with us. No, that's not right. Now get up there. You want to start it.
No one knows exactly who started it, but this is how a Cinco de Mayo celebration ended up today at Inglewood High School.
The black kids decided to do a payback, what they call it. They decided that they would walk out of the Cinco de Mayo meeting.
Students and police officers tell us that apparently the whole thing began last February when allegedly a group of Hispanic students walked out of a Black History Month assembly. Well, today it seems that a group of black students walked out of a Cinco de Mayo celebration.
Yes, we did walk out, but they the one hit us first.
Well, people were getting hit with bats, bottles.
And they just started saying black power, so they start hitting us, so we start hitting them back.
School officials canceled classes, dismissed students, and called Inglewood police. But the encounters continued outside, where even desperate parents looking for their children got caught in the middle.
Why you fight? Because you black and I'm Mexican. You both together killing by yourself. There's no reason you guys fight like that.
Many parents blame school officials for the violence.
And then they knew Cinco de Mayo was coming up, so they had planned to do this. But when you talk with some of the officials and tell them before time, things going one ear and out the other.
But school officials insist this is not a racial issue.
If a few students did something and another few students did another thing, that is not a black-brown issue. Our students are not hostile towards each other.
But that didn't seem to be the case today. Several students suffered minor injuries. School police say there were no arrests. In Inglewood High School, Cristina Gonzalez, Fox News.
Right, so I didn't play this video to like really sort of reinscribe this like this very erroneous idea that black and brown people sort of inherently hate each other, right? But more so to try to understand like the context that a lot of the people who I've interviewed and met with kind of grew up in. You know, this was a time, like I said before, when this is a time of this very real influx of Mexican immigrants to South LA and Central American immigrants to South LA. It's also the time of factory jobs, union jobs were being shipped out. There was a sort of exodus of black folks to places like Riverside, San Bernardino, right? So all these things were happening at once, and often black and brown people were essentially blaming each other, right? You know, instead of looking at the larger sort of like structural forces that were creating the instances of sort of deprivation of economic resources, health resources, educational resources, right? You know, you essentially had two communities who were left to really blame each other, right? So this is part of the context. And this is a moment in time in which someone like Memo, really grows up in, right? Memo today, I have to say, when I met him 3 years ago, he didn't have the same notoriety or fame that he has today. I don't know if anyone here has heard of Memo and his most amazing underground party scene that he started called Night of the Blaxican. I don't know, has anyone heard about that here? Well, the night of you have back there. Have you been? Yeah. Okay, cool. So Memo is someone who to me epitomizes this experience in South LA, right? He grows up in South LA, a black father, Mexican mother, and is often racialized as a black American, but grows up in a very sort of Mexican home, right? Like culturally, ethnically, culinary, linguistically. And he's someone who today has really used his own experience as a way to sort of bring black and brown people together through this really huge underground party scene in South Los Angeles called Night of the Blaxican. This is what Memo shared with me about his story growing up when I met with him. If there was a race riot when I was younger, I would go to the Mexican side. If there was a crew thing, I would go to the Mexican side. A lot of Mexicans would be like, damn those morenitos, damn those black fools. And that messed me up for a really long time. I was riding on one side of the road with just one people until I got to high school. In the 10th grade, I started kicking it with black people for the first time, really. I became friends with them, and my best friend was this Jamaican dude. And that was the craziest thing for me because I had never been with black people before. Because it was easier for me to identify with Mexicans because I was brought up with my aunt in Compton and in Watts in a very traditional Mexican household. Now I'm the most balanced Blaxican I know. I'm dead in the middle, his words. Deadbolt. I'm so down with both my people, it's ridiculous. I would die for either of them. And it took me a long time to love who I was, the whole me. And so Memo's story, again, speaks about this idea, this sort of sensibility of brokenness, right? That is often, dumped on people, that is often inherited, that is learned, these very ideas of brokenness. Nobody is born broken, right? There's often moments in our lives that create these very real feelings. But Memo today is someone who has kind of figured it out, right? That he can be both black and brown at the same time. But Robert's story kind of speaks to this idea of learning about his black and brownness, not in Los Angeles, but instead in Nayarit, right? In a state in Mexico, and how his learning about anti-black racism, learning what it meant to be both black and brown, didn't occur in Los Angeles, but really while visiting his relatives and grandparents and aunts and uncles in his mother's hometown. As a young kid, I was fortunate enough to be able to live in Mexico with my grandparents. It was a small town just miles away from Guayabitos, Nayarit. I spoke the language fluently as well as reading and writing. I went to school out there for kindergarten. It was a great time for horseplay. Literally, I was a cowboy. But I was different from everyone else. I stood out. I was, quote unquote, the mixed kid. No one ever really had seen a black person up close before. So I was picked on a lot, and I got into a lot of fights. But I wasn't oblivious to the prejudice I was subjected to. But I wouldn't say my time in Mexico was a bad one, not by any means, because there's always going to be people who don't understand. So Robert's experience in Nayarit kind of speaks to how blackness is sort of constructed in Mexico, right? We know that throughout the 17th and 19th centuries, over 200 enslaved Africans were imported to Mexico through the port city of Veracruz. But we know that most of these communities and these groups stayed in Veracruz, Guerrero, Oaxaca, these sort of southern states, right? So what this means to me is that states like Nayarit, for example, which is on the western coast, only understood blackness through popular media, popular culture, and film, which if anyone knows Mexico's racial history is very problematic, right? So, being the mixed kid, being quote unquote the black kid in Nayarit, Mexico, for Robert, came with this idea that anti-black racism is real, and it exists on both sides of the border, right? This one of the last stories that I'll share is about this woman named Jennifer who I met a few years ago. And so her narrative, her excerpt, kind of, I think, underscores this idea that in so many ways identity is layered, it's complex, it's vast, and by no means is it meant to fit inside of a racial box, right? This is what she shared with me. I tell people that I'm black and Mexican. I don't say half black and I don't say half Mexican. It's a difference when you tell people that you aren't half and half, because it's an invitation for people to feel you out and ask you how black or how Mexican you are. So I want to emphasize that my parents are two full people, and that yeah, and that they didn't give half of themselves to me. They gave all of themselves to me. So it's about double and not half. So I say black and Mexican. I've also been asked, why palms, right? And why photographs? And, what is it about, is it like a hand obsession or something like that? Like, what's going on, right? It's not any of those. But I always found it so interesting. I think two things are happening here. I always ask people to both meet me somewhere in Los Angeles that speaks to your identity, speaks to a neighborhood that impacted how you think about yourself. And I think about hands and what we carry in our palms, what we can carry. We can carry photos, we can carry memories, trauma, tension, all these different things, right? But I ask people to bring photos, right? To bring different forms of ephemera, right? Photos in particular, because even though this is like a very social media project and nobody prints out photos anymore, we still have them, right? And there's a very sort of, it makes this even more real to see how the different worlds sort of come together in our palms, right? So that's kind of why I always ask people about that. One of the last photos I'll share and stories, I think kind of, like this photo kind of makes us think about a few questions, right? Like what does LA's black and brown story, like how can that inform us about the current sort of political and racial climate, right? Particularly thinking about Donald Trump and these very real sort of anti-black, anti-Mexican sentiments. So what is like a story, a research project, a sort of narrative about LA's black and brown story? What can that tell us about black and brown sort of coalitions, right? What does the growing sort of black skin experience tell us about the future of race and racial identity in Los Angeles, right? And I think more broadly, what can it tell us about the future of the US? Since the early 1990s, Mexican immigrants have sort of began to transcend traditional immigrant sort of enclaves, right, in cities. So what this means is that Mexican immigrants started to move beyond Los Angeles, right, San Francisco, places like Phoenix, El Paso, et cetera, and really began to settle in these sort of non-traditional, receiving sites, they're called. States like North Carolina, states like Alabama and Georgia, right? So it seems to me that, these Mexican immigrants are often living, working, in historically black communities, as they did in South Los Angeles. So really, a story about Los Angeles and its own sort of black skin story, black skin experience, I think to me has very real political and racial implications for the future of the South, essentially, right? Where you have an increase of Mexican immigrants, of black and brown people who are living, working, and essentially loving together, right? But when I met Ken, Sophia, and Alejandra last year at their home, I was really curious about, what it means to raise a young black and Mexican woman in this sort of climate, right? So I asked them, like Donald Trump is spewing hate. He is speaking about Mexicans in a certain way, about women, about black folks, about immigrants, right? So what does it mean to raise Sophia in this current moment? And what they said was, they told me this: we will explicitly teach her to be proud of the fact that she is Mexican and to be proud of the fact that she is black. There's no other way. These words reminded me of one of my professors at UCLA's words, Gay Teresa Johnson, that she said in her book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity. Gay Johnson wrote, "Taken together, Blackskins express a political identity in articulation of spatial entitlements that make unexpected use of space and offer the possibilities of peace, justice, and human dignity, offering an important model for building mutually beneficial and meaningful futures." So families like Ken, Sophia, and Alejandra, in so many ways, perhaps the prospects of building a, quote, mutually beneficial and meaningful future has really already arrived. Thank you.
We'll now have time for questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and Sarah or I will come to you. If you're called on, please stand up and introduce yourself before asking your question.
Thanks for coming to speak today. My question for you relates to the conflict between sort of like minority communities and staying true to your community and dating outside of it. And so it seems like, like my cousin right now is dating a Latina woman, and his mom is upset that he's not, dating an Ethiopian or Eritrean woman, right. And all of our younger cousins are upset he's not staying black. And so, my question to you is, how do you sort of overcome the challenges of overlooking, inequalities when finding partners of the other race, but how do you also stay true to your community and not fall victim to these implicit biases when you enter these relationships?
Right.
If that makes sense.
That's a great question. Yeah. So I think intimacy and partner selection and dating pools. It's all very complex, right? And it's all very personal. And I think there's like something very subjective about that, right? There's no sort of like blanket way to understand like why and how people kind of love someone else, right? But I think maybe a way to understand that is that, I think we are so complex and we can do different things simultaneously, right? Like, I think, you can date someone outside of your race, right? And also be very committed to racial justice, right? Like, I think about Frantz Fanon. I think about Audre Lorde. I think about Henry Louis Gates Jr., right? These are all people who were with white people, right? Like Frantz Fanon, Audre Lorde, dated white people. Maya Angelou, married a white man, right, for about 5 or 6 years. So, because you're with someone outside of your race does not mean that you can't be committed to sort of eradicating Brian. All right. Start is full. All right, got that. Cool. All right, cool. Thanks, Brian. But you know what I mean, right? So it's like entirely complex, and I think you can do it. And I think the hope is also like with this younger generation, right? I think maybe our parents and older generations have more sort of entrenched ideas about intimacy and about romance and about like being able to sustain your ethnic and racial identity only through marrying someone who shares that identity. I think that's completely false, right? And I think it's challenging, but there's a way to do it. Just because you love someone outside of your race doesn't mean that you aren't committed to loving who you are fully and loving people in your race, right? So hope that answered your question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. It's really rare that we get speakers coming to talk about race, ethnicity, especially in a critical way, so this was really important, and your work is really important. Thank you. And I was wondering, you talked a little bit about how your work has been in some ways with the Nicki Minaj post used to fuel this like fetishization and tokenization of mixed bodies, so I'm wondering how you prevent your work from doing that while increasing visibility of Black and brown folks and Blaxicans, but kind of help to mitigate this tokenization and fetishization that often happens?
Yeah, it's a great question also. Like, it's super interesting, right? How I think I might be critical and I might be very sort of explicit about, trying not to be tokenized or like trying not to create these like super exoticized sort of images and representations, kind of thinking about like historical anthropology, right? Where you have these white anthropologists who essentially parachute into like a village or a community and take these very sort of like sensational photos of the other, right? So I'm not trying to do that, by no means. But also with that said, like, I think once you create a piece of art or publish something, it's really not yours anymore to own. It's up to the world and society to interpret it in the way that they want to. I hope that looking at these images that we can tell that I'm trying to portray this experience in a very honorable, very respectful, and a very real and nuanced way. Like I'm not creating these images because I'm like, yeah, like Black and brown people love each other all the time. And they don't, they get along all the time. Look, like Black and brown people, right? That's not the goal. I think the goal is to like create a very sort of like, journalistic, exploratory understanding of this experience in hopes that it allows us to understand other experiences, right? Because like one thing I always say is that yes, this is a project about Blaxicans, but there's something very universal about this. And that is that at the core of this, right, this is a project about belonging and not belonging, right? And I think that's something we can all kind of connect to regardless of race, right?
Hi, my name is Maria Jose, and I'm a junior here at Pomona, well, over there. My question is more around like the gender dynamics between like these two couples. It seems that the older couples were more like Black men and like Latinx women, and now like it seems that it's a little like shifting to like be the opposite, Latinx men and Black women. Did your interlocutors like ever speak about these like gender dynamics that are also racialized, and like what did they say? Like how was that at home or like between the parents or even like themselves?
Right. Yeah. Totally. Great question. So this idea about, I think, we typically see in popular culture and in media and in photos and images a Black man and a brown woman, right? I think that's like the sort of canonical understanding like black and brown relations. But I think you're absolutely right. There is a younger generation that understands that, gender and sexuality and intimacy is like very sort of intricate, right? And it's not necessarily tied to this very gendered approach of like, okay, you have a black man and a brown woman, and they're supposed to get along and be in love, right? But I think, that's also something that I've been very explicit about trying to find, right? Like trying to complicate ideas about black and brown intimacy, like what does that look like in the like queer context, right? Like what does that look like in like understanding like brown men and black women? Are there different sort of complications and layers there to unpack in comparison to like a black man and a brown woman, right? So I think that's part of the work that I've been trying to do. My recent work is a project called Melanina. It came out about a month ago, and it kind of speaks to like black and brown sort of intimacies in this current Trump moment, right? And that's something that that I was very sort of explicit about, right? Like trying to complicate the understanding that it's always a black man and a brown woman who are getting along, who are loving each other. So that's work that I hope to continue to really challenge, right? And get to through photos and through research. Another question.
Okay, another question I have relates to like how different communities share their culture and how to do so in a respectful and appropriate way without sort of taking advantage of them. So recently we had a bit of a scandal on campus about white women wearing hoop earrings. And so, and that's, I think, something that a lot of people here like felt very passionate about. And so for, like minority communities in this like in America, for example, where like the white community is very like prevalent and powerful and can so easily like take from another culture with little thought, like what's the way to do so appropriately, or like how are we supposed to like have these like conversations in ways that are respectful and not like vilifying, if you will.
Yeah. So you're asking me like generally speaking, or in regards to generally speaking. Yeah, I think that's a conversation that really I think about power dynamics, right? And I think about capitalism, and I think about sort of like cultural appropriation and extracting elements of a particular culture and of a society, like very sort of sacred practices related to food or clothing or hoop earrings, right? We can argue are part of these like sacred practices, right? Practices that really have been used to sustain a particular community amid white racial violence or like structural racism, right? So I think maybe the way to do it is to, that's a tough question, because I think we're all sort of complicit in this larger sort of like capitalistic system, right? So I think I want to say that, creating our own sort of, ways to promote, our lives, right? Our practices, our ethnic sort of practices is a way to go. And it makes me think about like Urban Outfitters, right? And like how problematic that is. And like, right, like all these quote unquote new designs that it comes up with every year that are not new, right? But that have existed for centuries around the world, right? So I think about that, and maybe it's boycotting that, right? Maybe it's finding ways to create our own businesses, our own sort of ways to create capital in our communities. That's a lofty goal, right? But I have no other answer. Right?
Hey, thank you for coming. So a lot of the participants that you interviewed and kind of spoke their words talked about participating in either like Black or Latina or Mexican culture. And I was wondering, because there's a big like Afro-Latina culture throughout the world, but whether a lot of the younger generation have kind of formed their like specific kind of mixed race cultures, whether that's Blaxican, Puerto Rican, that are like centered in the modern city and not necessarily throughout Latin America.
Yeah. So you're asking me about like how Los Angeles or like how different regions influence these like emerging multiracial identities?
Yeah, kind of how they create specific like mixed or culture that isn't specifically Black or Mexican or Latino, but there's like actually that combination.
Got you, for sure, yeah. So I think, you know, one thing I have to be like very sort of explicit and honest about, right, is the ways in which this whole legacy of like hypo descent, like the one drop rule in the U.S. is like a very real thing, right? So like I can't sit here and like romanticize like, oh, these are like black and Mexican, black and brown people. You know, ultimately, I say 98% of the people in this project are being racialized as black in the U.S., right? So they are African Americans to society, to the world, right? So I think, you know, what's interesting about that is that like ostensibly, right, phenotypically, you of course, you know, embody blackness, but I think internally something else happens, right? Where this like very sort of, you know, there's like a tension between how we identify internally and how we're read in society, right? So I think for these people, you know, who most of which I would say don't speak Spanish, right? A large percentage because of the very real sort of anti-black racism that they experience in their Latino families, right? But for a lot of these people, it's like reclaiming the ability, right? Even if it doesn't happen all the time, it's like people want the option of identifying with these different cultures. But there are some people who like Memo, for example, right? I'm deadbolt, I'm the blackest, brownest black skin you know, right? Like, that's how he's identifying it, and that's how he sees the world. And so I think like in thinking about this whole like third space sort of thing, you know, third space culture kids and you know, Hapas and Mexi Jews and Mexipinos, all these different like words and terms that are emerging at this point, which to me just like kind of symbolizes like this reinvention of language, right? It's like a very sort of US thing to do, right? To like reinvent who you are like linguistically, right? So I think this like sort of interstitial sort of thing that's going on, right? It's both romantic, but it's also tactile and it's real. And so I think, you know, a lot of these people show that, you know, they are trying to find ways to negotiate these different worlds simultaneously. And some succeed and some fail, right?
Hi, thank you for coming. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I think that work like this is really important. My name is Francisco. I grew up in East LA, so this is something that like feels very personal and like something I can really relate to. I want to talk a little, or like I want to ask a question that relates more to like Memo and the Night of the Blaxican like event, which you slightly talked about. So like I've been to a few of those events, and right, like it's very much about like solidarity between black and brown communities, which is like super amazing, and like whoever has had the chance to go, it's like such an amazing group of people who come together to put this event. What I'm wondering is like how, like, in what ways are like events like this, like right, acts of revolution or moving towards like, moving towards a place where conversations about anti-blackness in Latinx communities is like more prevalent, and how like black and brown tensions in Los Angeles and in other communities are like very real, but how, like in what ways and what platforms can be used, or how can an event like this be used to mobilize and have those conversations?
Right, totally. So you know, I spoke to Memo about a week and a half ago actually, and I spoke to him because I was contacted by Fusion to write a story about the Night of the Blaxican, right? So I call Memo, he doesn't answer. I call him again, he doesn't answer. And so I text him twice, and he finally responds, right? And I'm like, Memo, you know, I want to write a story about the Night of the Blaxican, right? I know Memo, I've been to his events, like, we're pretty cool, right? And Memo's like, okay, sure, but for who? And why do you want to write it, right? So I tell him, you know, it's for Fusion, and he responds, he's like, you can't do it. I don't want you writing it, right? And so I asked Memo why, right? And he goes, well, I want to keep it underground. I want to keep it about the people, you know? And so Memo's response is I think, kind of like, you know, I mean, I was bummed, right? You know, I want to write the story. You know, I think it'll be a great story. But I think, you know, it's like what Memo is doing is he's doing it like in a very non-commercial way, in a way that is like, to me, reflects like the nature of social media. You know, it's so accessible. And Memo is doing this in a way that I haven't really seen in LA done before. You know, you've been to his event. Black people, brown people, all types of folks are there, right? And he's creating a situation where these conversations about anti-blackness, about, you know, white supremacy, about Black and brown relations are occurring and they're happening. And, you know, I salute Memo, and I think events like that are kind of a way to do it, you know, in a way that doesn't involve these like large multimedia companies, you know, in very sort of grassroots ways, in ways that really impact your heart and your mind, right, and your hips, right, you know, because you're dancing at these events, right? So I think that's maybe a way to do it, you know, and there are, you know, musicians like MED, like Chemo the Blackskin, like Miguel, for example, who is also a Blackskin, right, whose latest album, Wild Heart, kind of speaks to ideas about race, about Black and Mexican sort of identity. So there are people doing it through the arts, right, and through music, and through art, and through photography, in ways that, you know, reach a larger audience. So there's definitely a lot of momentum right now and a lot of traction. So I think the question is, like, how do you sustain that, right? And like, what's the future of that, you know, as social media continues to grow, right?
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciated your insight. I wrote down my question so I wouldn't forget it. Does this new way or perspective of looking at biracialness differently extend to not only people who grow up from parents of different ethnicities, but also to people who are born to parents of one culture, but grow up in a different culture? And I'm speaking personally from my own experience, like being born in Ethiopia and like with Ethiopian culture, and then coming to America and there's a different culture. And like where does this whole conversation fit for someone who's looking for like validity in their identity?
Totally. That's a great question. I used to tutor Benyam when he was in 8th grade, so I kind of know Benyam. But yeah, that's a great question, right? And it kind of makes you think about like these like very real sort of generational differences, right? Like generational differences are very real, you know, and like how people think about themselves, and maybe like how our immigrant parents sort of like their whole basis, you know, survival for them meant like, you know, adopting and acclimating to like American society, right? And like doing everything they could to like fit in and you know, and work and send money back home, et cetera. I think our experience is maybe a little different. You know, like we have the ability, we have the privilege, right, of being able to question things in a way that our parents could not, right? So I think that's maybe how it starts, right? It's like, I think understanding like, yes, maybe my mother or aunt and I like don't see eye to eye on an issue, but there's like a very sort of a very real backstory that accompanies that, right? So I think, you know, there's a privilege in even being at a place like this, right? And having this conversation. Our parents could never be here, right? So I think that's part of it. It's like continuing these conversations and understanding that our lives and our identities are inherently transnational, right? Like, you know, the world and conversations are no longer as siloed as they once were. You know, if you wanted, I'm sure you could probably communicate with your family in Ethiopia, right? In Addis Ababa or so forth, right? So it's, you know, that is, I think, the pace of communication. And, you know, we are inherently transnational, and I think understanding that is important for maybe answering your question, right?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the importance of art in expressing your complex identity in society. I saw specifically on the flyer that you're doing a slam poetry event on Friday, and so maybe maybe you're going to
I'm
the
not a
event.
poet, but
Okay.
sure,
Well, if you could just speak more broadly about
yeah, sure,
art
sure.
and that impact.
Am I doing that on Friday? Am I reciting poetry? Okay. It's like, wow, I just got super nervous. I'm never. Cool. Yeah. No. So I think there's definitely like I think we have more freedom in the arts. You know, there's more freedom to express, to challenge, to question in the arts and in photography and in film and in music than we do sometimes in like these very sort of formal and structured academic sort of settings, right? So I think the arts has always provided us with an opportunity to imagine the world in different ways, right? In ways that really transcend maybe how entrenched and our realities are, right? The arts allow us to really think about the world and our experiences in ways that are extremely emotive, right? Like, you know, the arts touches people in a way that text and words do not. You know, they allow us to interpret an image, a sort of like visual culture, in a way that speaks to our experience and doesn't, right? So I think, and that's kind of the goal of this project, right? Is to integrate these very different, these different worlds, right? So at Stanford, right, I was really interested in this, and I remember my mentor was like, "You want to do what? You want to use Instagram and you want to take photos of people, and you want to take photos of people's palms, right? Like, what does that have to do with academic research, right?" And I think that was sort of the pushback of these like very sort of ivory tower, academics, right? No judgment, right? But or shade, but these like people who really can't see about the power of photography and of arts and finding ways to like cultivate these different worlds. I think you always want to create the clearest message possible, and I don't think it could be done using one medium. You have to use all mediums. It has to be multimodal, right? And so that's what I see in the arts. I see an incredible amount of hope and opportunity, and freedom, and that I don't really see in qualitative research and surveys and quantitative data, right? So that's what I see.
This will be our last question.
Hi, my name is Luis, and my question is a follow-up question, just because arts are usually just a hit or miss. I know going to college and deciding that you want to major in something with the arts just puts a lot of pressure on you, because you might not make it. Money's a big issue. I just think it's, how does one commit to the arts coming from a low-income background, coming from a marginalized identity? And I don't know how to explain that, because some of us feel pressured to follow an engineering or follow something like economics, something that's more income securing.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think like your question kind of can hit so many different communities, right? So many different racial and ethnic communities, particularly communities of color, right? It's like, if you're not trying to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor, like, what are you doing, right? Like you and me, like I'm trying to get a PhD, and half of my family thinks I'm a medical doctor, like, or trying to be a medical doctor, and right. So it's just like understanding that, like there's a big risk involved with that, particularly because a lot of us don't have the like economic and social safety nets, right? That a lot of people have. Most art programs, most art schools are not entirely composed of people of color, right? For so many different reasons, but we don't have the safety nets, right? So it's a big risk, and I think with anything that we do, you have to risk that, right? And it's tough. It speaks to these different sort of inequities that sort of exist in our society, and like I kind of it's even a tough question to answer. It's like, what do you do, right? Do you tell someone to like follow their dreams and their goals and their aspirations and like, yeah, go all the way, do that, go to art school, drop out of art school, be an artist, what do you do, right? And I think you have to sort of like think about like the income, right? And being able to feed yourself and your family and supporting your family as well. These are things that a lot of people in art school don't have to think about. And it's a challenge, and I think, again, like maybe creating our own platforms, our own sort of ways to express ourselves, our own networks, is maybe a way to do it. Yeah, that's a tough question, but thank you for asking that.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Thompson Hernandez.